point out what exactly is going on where we are and what has been going on here in Mark. So, you remember Mark chapter 11, Jesus enters into Jerusalem and he accepts this public acclamation. He accepts being called Messiah. And of course that sets off the religious leaders. So then remember we got the story about Jesus cursing the fig tree, about the fig tree withering, and right sandwiched in between those, we've got about Jesus cleansing the temple. And all of that is intended to communicate that because Judaism had become so corrupt, especially in rejecting Messiah, that a curse from God was going to come upon it. And so, the religious authorities next, at the end of chapter 11, they come to Jesus and they question him by what authority is he doing the things that he's doing. I mean, what gave him the right to come into their temple and cleanse it? And so Jesus responds to that, chapter 12, with the parable of the tenants. And the purpose of that is to show that these wicked tenants, would not give their rent, if you will, to the owner of the vineyard in the same way the Jewish rulers weren't giving God his due, especially because they were not recognizing Jesus as Messiah. And so judgment was going to come upon them. And so then you see a couple of attempts by these Jewish rulers to get Jesus to track him. You see first the Pharisees and the Herodians with the question about paying taxes to Caesar, and then the Sadducees with their question about resurrection there in chapter 12. And then you see that not all of them are bad. Not all of the leaders are bad. You have this honest teacher of the law who comes to Jesus and asks, what's the greatest man? Well, Jesus answering those questions shut everybody up. Nobody's going to ask him any more questions. But then Jesus asks a question. He asks a question about Messiah. And it seems like the point of the question is to show that Messiah is so great that opposing Messiah is going to bring about the downfall. And so he makes this quote from Psalm 110. And he shows how that God the Father would put all of Messiah's enemies under his feet. And they need to understand that, there's a death sentence on their head if they continue to oppose God's Messiah. And so then Jesus just launches, as we noted in class last week, verses 38 through verse 40, verse 41? Verse 40. He launches this assault. He goes from being on the defensive, he goes on to the offensive, and he launches this assault upon the teachers of the law, these leaders, and denounces them for their corruption. And then that leads us to the passage that we're going to begin class with today. The passage is entitled, The Widow's Offering. All right, and what I want us to see is, you remember in the denunciation that Jesus gave against the teachers of the law, remember what he said, verse 40 of Mark 12? They devour widows' houses, and for a show they make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely. He's going to give an example as to how they devour widows' houses. He's going to bring up this widow whose house essentially is devoured. Now, it's her own generosity. But anyway, there's going to be this contrast between this widow and everybody else. Okay, so let's read this passage. Mark 12, verse 41, and we'll read through the end of the chapter. So Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on." So here Jesus is in the temple, and probably where he is in the temple is in the court of women. And he sits opposite the place where the offerings were put. Now this isn't the only time in the gospel accounts that we read about Jesus being in the place where the offerings were put. Look at John chapter 10. John chapter 10. John chapter 10 and verse 22. Wait, is that the right verse? I don't think that's the right verse. No, John chapter 8, verse 20. Sorry.
John chapter 8?
John 8 and verse 20. I was taking you to the passage about Hannah, but wrong place.
He was in the temple in that verse, so.
He was, right. That's right. So look at John 8:20. So Jesus spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts near the place where the offerings were put. Yet no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. So there's a Jewish work called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was written in about 200 AD. But it reflects Jewish tradition that went way back far, way back to the time of Jesus and even before. And the Mishnah tells us that in this court of women, there were 13 trumpet-shaped receptacles. And that's the place where the offerings were put. So Jesus is sitting opposite these 13 trumpet-shaped receptacles in the court of women. And that's where they would come and they would give their contribution. So notice the NIV says that Jesus was sitting here opposite the place where the contributions were collected there in back to Mark 12:41. And the NIV says he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Literally, it says he watched how the crowd put their money into the temple treasury. He's not just watching them put their money into the temple treasury, but he's observing and he's making a judgment as to how they put their money into the temple treasury. And so, we see at the end of verse 41 that all of these rich people come and they drop in large amounts. And everybody can see them dropping the large amounts into the temple treasury. But then, verse 42, this poor widow, it's not just a widow, she is a poor widow. She came and she put in only 2 small copper coins. All right, now, how small are these copper coins? Well, these are the smallest coins that were in circulation. Right, so the average pay for a day laborer at that time was a Roman coin called a denarius. Okay? You might consider, for instance, Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. We're told, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day." So that's a day's wage, a denarius. Well, these 2 small copper coins, each of those 2 small copper coins was worth 1/128th of 1 denarius. So together, the NIV says they amount to 2 cents, so 1/64th of a denarius. So what would that amount to? Just a few cents. That's what she put in. So all these rich people are putting in large amounts, and here she is. She puts in the equivalent of 1/64th of the amount of money just a poor average day laborer would make for a day's work. That's what she put in. And so, if she put that in, people despise it. What is that? How does that really help the work of the temple? But Jesus is watching, not just that people are putting money into the treasury, but he's watching how the people put their money into the treasury. He's not concerned about the amount. He's concerned about the heart that's motivating the contribution. And so, verse 43, calling his disciples to him, nobody thought anything about this widow putting money into the treasury. I mean, 1/64th of a denarius. If they did call attention to it, it was just, what is that? But Jesus thinks this is significant. He doesn't call the disciples to see, the guy that drops in the big check. 1 second. We may not sound for the first little bit on the video. Anyway, what's that? We did? Okay, good. He wasn't interested in calling a press conference for the guy that would come and would give $10 million. He calls the disciples over to call attention to this widow who gave 1/64 of a denarius, and he said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others." Well, that can't be. In an objective sense, 1/64 of a denarius is not more than everybody else together put in. But to Jesus it was. Jesus said she put in more than everybody else put in. And here's the reason. They all gave out of their wealth. They didn't make a sacrifice. They had more than they needed. They had an abundance. They gave out of their wealth. It is not a big deal for Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Tesla, Elon Musk. It's not a big deal for them to give $10 million. $10 million for them is about like us giving, 25 cents. That's not a deal. Jesus didn't consider that worthy of calling a press conference. They all gave out of their wealth. But she, out of her poverty, put in everything. Now the NIV says all she had to live on. And I mean, that's a correct translation, but literally it is all her life. She gave all her life. That was it. That was everything. And so we have here an important passage to help us understand what how God views our giving. It's not about the amount per se. It's about our heart, and it's about the sacrifice. So that's a major lesson we can get from this. But a second major lesson we can get from this is to help us see the corruption of the temple. Because it is not insignificant that this story is told after verse 40, where these teachers of the law devour widows' houses. And it's told to us before chapter 13, where Jesus will talk about the destruction of that very temple where this contribution was made. And, it is not a good thing for any religious institution to get rich off the backs of widows. Sometimes I hear people talking about tithing and how important tithing is. And tithing can be a very helpful way to give. And, for some people, tithing is the right way to give. For some people, tithing doesn't involve them giving enough. If you're an Elon Musk and you tithe, that's not much. I mean, he living off 90%, it's not much of a sacrifice for him. And there are some people who have no business tithing. A poor widow who can barely afford to make ends meet and have food after paying her rent and after buying her medicine and paying her other bills. She can't afford to give 10%. And by the way, there is no New Testament command to tithe. Tithing was an Old Testament command. And tithing ended at the cross as a set command with animal sacrifice and other things of that sort. So, God leaves it up to us to decide the amount. We give as we're prospered. And we all have to, in our hearts, make that decision as to what's the right amount for us, knowing that Jesus did teach a lot about money. And that certainly is going to be a major subject at the judgment. And there's lots of warnings about not hoarding money and laying up treasure for yourselves upon the earth and not turning a cold glance toward the person who really is in need and about supporting the Lord's work and all of that. Any thoughts? Yes.
Speaking of tithing, when they gave, what was it, like 10% instead of,
Right. Yeah, tithe means 10%.
but it was whatever of all that they had. So it wasn't like how much money they had. It was like
Right.
livestock and sheep, goats.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the tithe, keep in mind the tithe was, an Israelite tax. The Israelites would tithe from everything that they would have, and it would be collected. It would support the Levites, and the Levites would tithe from what they got, and it would support the priests. And then every third year, you had a tithe that stayed in the community where you were, and that went for the poor, for the fatherless, for the widow. But that's the way that the tithe was a way chiefly to keep the work of the temple going on. I mean, it was a form of a tax for Israel. Yeah.
You read in the Mishnah about these trumpet-shaped containers. Do you know what they were made of?
I don't remember.
Metallic, so when you threw your money in it, it made a lot of noise?
I don't know. I don't remember reading that. I'll give you the reference. It's Mishnah, S-H-E-K are the first four letters. I don't remember the rest. And 6.5 is the section. We can look at it, but I don't remember the rest. And the Mishnah, if you've never read the Mishnah, you can't understand how hard it is to read the Mishnah. I mean, it was written in Hebrew, which I can't read. I've got an English translation of it. But man, it's rough. All right, other comments? Yes.
It's always been that God has had a time for us to give a sacrifice, to give back to God out of what He's given us. And we think of the first one that we know about was Cain and Abel. Cain gave the one which was the best that he had, and Abel's was out of a surplus of his. It was just something that he could do without. And then we have the example that David gives whenever he's at Arun's threshing floor. There's a plague, and God halts the plague at Arun's threshing floor and tells him to sacrifice to God. And so Arun's going to give him anything. And he says, I can't give a sacrifice that costs me nothing. So a sacrifice is supposed to cost us something.
Right.
Something's missing that we would miss if we give this to the Lord. Certainly the widow is going to miss.
Yeah, she didn't give 10%, she gave 100%.
Gave all that she had, she was certainly going to miss that. But
Right.
It's an example that Jesus praises.
Right. And look at 2 Corinthians 8. Corinth, even though there was some present distress, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 7:26, we don't know what that was. It apparently did not cause the Corinthian church to be poor. I mean, you didn't have the wealthiest Corinthians as members of the Corinthian church because, not many of them, 1 Corinthians 1:26, were mighty, not many noble, not many, etc., whenever they were called. But apparently they were doing well. The church was doing well. The churches of Macedonia not so well. So Paul in 2 Corinthians 8:9 writes to encourage the church at Corinth to make good on their promise to take up this collection for the poor Jewish Christians who were in Judea. And Paul's wanting to help foster unity in the church with that. But anyway, notice what he says in 2 Corinthians 8. Verses 1 to 5, and he's writing from somewhere in Macedonia. So, what churches are in Macedonia? Well, Philippi is in Macedonia, and Thessalonica, and Berea. Those are some of the churches there in Macedonia. So, 2 Corinthians 8, beginning in verse 1. And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. So they gave an amount beyond what Paul asked them to give, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service for the Lord's people. So Paul thought it was too much. Paul seemingly tried to say no, but they just implored him, no, we want to help. And Paul will make the point that they were stirred up by the example of the Corinthians that Paul had told them about. But anyway, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord and then, by the will of God, to us. So, it is permissible to give beyond our ability. That's permissible. It's not demanded of us to give beyond our ability. It's demanded of us to give according to our ability. But we are permitted to give beyond our ability. And that was the example of this widow. She gave beyond her ability. That wasn't required of her. But she did it. There may be some circumstances in our lives where it's not wise to give beyond our ability. Look at 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And, here would be one of the churches that's praised by Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 that we just read about. So Paul earlier had written to the Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians 4, well, we'll just start in verse 10. And in fact, you do love all God's family throughout Macedonia. And of course, they still did when Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. Now they're loving God's family that's in Judea. Yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more, and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Now that should be a goal of ours, to work with our own hands so we support ourselves, so that we're not dependent on anyone. And so it's possible that we could give so generously, we so impoverish ourselves, that we make ourselves dependent on other people, which isn't necessarily a good thing. So, there's a lot of wisdom that needs to go into deciding how much to give and so forth. But anyway. Other comments?
Can you touch on back in Corinthians, where were we at in verse 8? 2 Corinthians 8:12.
Okay.
The meaning of that is?
Let me get over to it. So Paul says, for if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. So the Corinthians were delaying taking up this contribution for Paul to carry to the poor saints in Judea. They had promised a year before this that they would make the contribution, but now there's this delay. And, Paul's had to correspond with them. He's written a hard letter to them since they made this promise. And Titus has just come back to him to give him a report as to how that hard letter has been received by the Corinthians, and they've repented, they've put out whoever the troublemaker was, and so forth. And so Paul is now sending Titus back with 2 Corinthians to the Corinthians, and he's telling them, hey, listen, as you promised a year ago, complete your promise, complete this contribution. But it seems like part of their reason for delay this year's delay is they're thinking, well, hey, if we wait just a little bit longer, we'll have more. Things are a little bit tight now. And so if we just get past tax season, if we just get past the harvest, if we just get past this, if we just get past that, then we'll be able to give more. And Paul makes the point, listen, it's not about the amount. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. So just keep your word and give what you got. Don't keep on delaying till you have more, which is probably just an excuse not to give. Any other thoughts, comments? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the tithing was an Old Testament guideline, for we're living under the New Testament, which is a better dispensation, so we should be giving more than 10%.
Well, some people should, but I don't. I mean, that's common. That's commonly argued. But I don't think that works. I mean, we could say, well, under the Old Covenant, they had 3 pilgrim festivals. They had to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And we're living under a better covenant, so we should go to Jerusalem 6 times a year. Or, under the Old Covenant, they had to fast on the Day of Atonement. They had 1 annual fast per year, but we're living under a better covenant, and so we ought to have 10 fasts per year. We could argue that way about any number of requirements under the Old Covenant that have not been brought over, and I think that if we argue that way, we're going to end up binding people's consciences with something that the Lord has not bound their conscience with, and so I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there's like we brought out the example of a widow, a Christian widow, who living on a fixed income. And right now, rent going up and everything going up, inflation. And, she loves the Lord, but man, is she not supposed to not pay her bills? Is she supposed to go into debt so that she can, give 15% and not 10%? If for some people like that, giving 10% would cause them to violate another command of the Lord, because Romans 13:8 says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except this one, to love your neighbor as yourself." And so we're supposed to be people who pay our debts. We're not supposed to not pay our debts, and binding her conscience in that way could cause her to violate that command. So anyway, I appreciate the thought, but I just don't necessarily agree with that line of argument.
Wouldn't a lot have to do with your conscience, your conscience?
Oh, it definitely.
And again, I think the hard thing is that we use our conscience to make it binding on other people. And that's, I think, where we really come into character.
Right.
In things with tithing and that purpose. Be careful, we kind of go beyond scripture.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to be very careful not to bind our opinions on other people's consciences. Yeah. So, yes, sir.
I just wanted to mention there's more than one way to give, so not fair. Because people who sacrifice their time, energy, and work for things they don't get paid for.
Oh, yeah.
There's also gift to God. You can't limit that amongst just dollars and cents.
Oh, that is such an important observation. Absolutely. You remember when Peter and John were about to go into the temple, and there was the beggar there at the gate of the temple, and Peter said to him, "Silver and gold have we none, but what we have we give to you." And I don't know that Peter and John at that point, they probably weren't getting much of a salary. If they were getting a salary, they were probably just getting fed. They couldn't tithe. They didn't have any money to give, but they gave what they had. And that's the way a lot of people that I've known in the Lord's church are. And it's what a gift it is to mow the church lawn. I mean, how much would it cost to hire someone to mow the church lawn? But to have brethren that come up and sacrifice hours to mow the church lawn, that's a big gift. Or to, work on church air conditioners. I mean, how much would it cost to hire an air conditioner guy? And we could just go on down the line. Those are ways to give, or work on the getting the recording set up and everything for these events. We could just go on down the line with so many people that give so much that's not money. Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on. We're just gonna get into just scratch the surface of chapter 13, but this is a really, really powerful chapter, and the point is, again, God's judgment on corrupt Judaism. It's corrupt because it did not recognize Messiah, even though it had the Scriptures. The Scriptures let you know the Messiah's address. The Scriptures let you know the Messiah's family. The Scriptures let you know, characteristics of Messiah. All this sort of stuff, and they had all these prophecies that let them know how they could identify Messiah, and they missed him. They missed it. And so Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. Chapter 13, I think, is possibly the most misinterpreted chapter in Mark. And then its parallels in Matthew and Luke are some of the most misinterpreted chapters in those books as well. Because this is a passage that has just often been used, as well as Matthew 24 and Luke chapter 17 and Luke chapter 21, has been used to feed some of the premillennial notions, the left behind notions. Yes, sir.
So you think it was really easy for them to know those prophecies applied to Jesus? I mean, we can see it now because we can see where it's explained in Matthew and Mark and all that kind of stuff. But you think they really did? They applied to the Messiah? I mean, because, a lot of nothing really says Messiah in the Old Testament.
Well, you have some passages that mention Messiah, name Messiah, but they all had messianic expectations. They're looking for a Messiah. They were just looking for the wrong kind of Messiah. They misinterpreted the prophecies, but Jesus held them accountable, and God held them accountable for not recognizing Jesus. Remember, Jesus said in John 5:39, "You search the Scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and they are they that testify of me." And
And he said, even if you don't believe me, believe the works. You've seen those things.
Right.
Those miracles that are done.
Yeah. Which, by the way, the miracles were foretold as being characteristics of Messiah. You had, healing miracles foretold in passages like Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6, that was viewed as messianic. Isaiah 53, verse 1, "Lord, who has believed our report, to whom the arm of the Lord has been revealed?" And arm of the Lord is just shorthand for God's miraculous powers. And, that is right there in the middle of that servant song. So yeah, they were blamed. They were to be blamed for not recognizing Jesus through the prophecies. Look.
The denomination today is
Yeah, absolutely. Look at Luke chapter 24. So the two on the road to Emmaus after Jesus' resurrection? Jesus appeared to them, but he kept his identity from them. And as they were walking along, here's what he said to them. Luke chapter 24 and verse 25. "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And, even at the start, and I mean, there's a lot more in that chapter as Jesus explains, from the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms of things concerning himself, verse 44. But look at John chapter 1. So, after, Jesus starts to collect followers, Peter's now following him, and, Jesus changed his name from Cephas to Peter and so forth, and now Philip is following Jesus, and Philip goes and finds Nathanael. Look at John 1:44. Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him. Now this is at the very start of, this is right after Jesus' baptism. We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, the one about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So there was this messianic expectation from the Old Testament. Yes, sir.
He asked him if he was the Christ, the Messiah.
Say that again?
He asked him if they knew that he was the Christ.
Well, if they could have known that Jesus was Messiah from Old Testament prophecy. Yeah, right. Yep.
My question is more of, how did they know these prophecies in the Old Testament were talking about the Messiah? That, how did they know that the Messiah was coming and all this kind of stuff? Because, when I read these things, if you read them in the correct light, yeah, you understand it. How did they get that light? That's what I mean. How did they know that, when David said, come make, I'll make you a footstool, your, enemies and all that kind of stuff. I mean, and the prophet, the virgin is going to give birth, but yet he also talks about a virgin that gives birth then too. So not all of those prophecies are equally clear. Okay, like the Isaiah 7 prophecy. That one's not as clear as, say, an Isaiah 53 prophecy. But we do have access to Jewish thought before the time of Jesus. We have access to rabbinic interpretations of those texts. And in the intertestamental literature, there's all these messianic expectations. And you see that right there with Philip saying to Nathanael, we found the one Moses wrote about. Moses said, God will raise up a prophet like unto me from among your brethren, and so on and so forth. And it makes the point at the end of Deuteronomy that to this day, no prophet has arisen like unto Moses, which shows that it's not fulfilled in Joshua. They all recognize there's something different. So you've got these prophecies that they all understood as being messianic in their focus. Yeah.
But there were some that were less clear. And they're ones that through the Holy Spirit, then, like the prophecy about, a virgin or a young woman shall conceive and give birth to a son. And by the way, the Hebrew word just means young woman. It doesn't mean virgin per se. It can mean virgin, but it's more generic than that. The Holy Spirit is the one who gave the insight. Now, virgin occurs in the Greek translation of it, but the Holy Spirit is the one that gave Matthew the insight to see that actually, that prophecy has a double fulfillment. So there are those that it took the Holy Spirit showing them for them to understand it, but there were other prophecies that they did understand as messianic that should have alerted them that, hey, Jesus is the one. The prophecies that just weren't disputed, like being born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2. When Herod, remember, and I know we've gone over, but I'm a long-winded preacher, so that won't stop me. So when Herod, got a visit from the Magi, and they asked, where Messiah was born, what did Herod do? Well, he called the Jewish leaders in and asked where Messiah was going to be born. And what did? They quoted Micah 5:2 in Bethlehem. So there were these messianic prophecies that everybody recognized that would alert them to Jesus. But then David makes the point about the miracles. If you don't believe me, believe the miracles. Jesus did works that no one else had done that should have let them know that he was from God. Okay, well, Lord willing, we'll pick up there next week.